any busy street, sit in a crowded restaurant, take a seat in a well-filled cinema, in particular, board a packed train, the chances are that somewhere in the immediate vicinity is a ghost, an actual, visible, audible, and, heaven help us, a solid ghost. This is an unpalatable truth that would be greeted with derision were it widely broadcast. Certainly, Percy Fortescue would have become gravely embarrassed if such a possibility had been presented to him as an undeniable fact. He was, therefore, totally unprepared when he saw the face of his dead wife staring at him from a window of the 5:45 train which was standing at platform 16 at Waterloo Station. She was sitting in the corner seat, wearing that blank, long-suffering look he remembered so well, and her steel-rimmed glasses reflected the light from an overhead platform lamp so that they resembled miniature suns. Percy's heart gave one violent thump, and the shock froze his reasoning powers into icy splinters of fear, so that he could only keep walking and finally seat himself in the compartment next to the driver's cab. Then his brain gradually resumed its natural function, and his thoughts came tripping over one another in a vain effort to present a rational theory. That woman could not possibly have been Doris. He repeated this comforting assertion over and over again, and was delighted to note a marked improvement in his morale. He then went on to list a number of excellent reasons why a defunct wife could not possibly be travelling on the 5:45 from Waterloo. One, she is dead. I was with her when she died. She said, "Oh dear," and died. 2, she was cremated, and her ashes sprinkled under a rose bush. Percy was very pleased now that he had decided on cremation. The fire was so final. An old-fashioned burial meant the component parts were still around, the bones still in existence, the skull intact and, goodness gracious, sealed up in a wooden box. She could still be in one piece. But the cremation oven disintegrated. It was as though she had never been. She did not exist. Then his nasty, inquiring brain recalled the memory of that face framed in a train window and began to go over the salient points. She had been wearing that awful blue hat that Percy had so detested, and, oh good Lord, there had been that little wen on the left side of her chin. The comforting thought of a Doris double began to fade. Surely the arm of coincidence could not be that long. But what was the alternative? Percy shifted uneasily, and a dour-faced woman to his left shot him a suspicious glance. A Doris ghost on a rush-hour train? An apparition on the 5:45? Percy giggled, and the dour-faced woman tried to edge away. When he alighted at Richmond, he had to have a second look. His heart once again began to beat unnaturally fast, and anticipation made icy fingers trail down his spine. But he had to seek reassurance. Surely a second look would prove beyond doubt that he had been mistaken, been deceived by a trick of light, deluded by a quirk of imagination. He walked along the platform, daring to look into each window, and disinterested faces stared back at him. Newspapers were rustled, and one saucy-eyed girl winked at him. But so far there was no sign of the face. A whistle blew, a voice shouted, "Right, Charlie!" and the train began to draw away. Percy stopped and faced the train as the carriages flashed by. Then, just as hope was maturing into blessed relief, he had a glimpse of Doris's face. Blue hat, steel-rimmed glasses, wen and all. He had the impression that just as the carriage tore out of his line of view, she turned her head so as to get a last look at him. It really was too much. He fainted on the platform, and a porter revived him with a cup of tea from the station buffet. Percy had a good worry all night, and so rose completely unrefreshed next morning. The shaving mirror reflected lines around his mouth, and his eyes looked like red-rimmed saucers with blue centres, but nevertheless the short passage of time had worn the horror down to a nagging uncertainty. Perhaps there was a woman who exactly resembled Doris, right down to an unfortunate taste in hats and a facial disfigurement. It was unlikely, but not impossible. Percy spoke aloud, a not unusual occurrence since he had been living alone. I should have got into that carriage and sat beside her. Next time he would, even if there was only standing room, and face this woman eye to eye. In fact, he would even open some kind of conversation with her. How about, forgive me, but you have an amazing resemblance to my late wife. I hope you don't mind my mentioning it. She would have to make some kind of response, even if it was only to tell him to push off, and then the bubble would burst. The illusion would shatter. She could not possibly have Doris's voice, not that low, precise whisper. He hoped she would have a voice like a foghorn. That would settle the matter once and for all. 3 weeks passed without so much as a glimpse of anyone who remotely looked like Doris, and uncertainty disintegrated into doubt. Maybe dissolved and became impossible. The gasp of fear went out as an echo, which returned as a laugh of self-ridicule. Peace of mind gave one last look back along the darkened avenues of time, then, like a well-fed cat, settled down before the fire of complacency and purred its contentment. Percy ceased to examine crowded railway carriages. The expected never happens. The unexpected pounces on the unprepared from the commonplace. Before Percy boarded the district train, he had to travel on the Underground, and it was here that his peace of mind was shattered forever. He was seated in a compartment that was full, but not crowded. Every seat was taken, but a few people were standing by the doors, where they either strap-hung or slouched, while wearing that look of painful resignation which is peculiar to their kind. Percy Fortescue was solving the Evening Standard crossword puzzle, and only looked up when the train roared into Charing Cross Station. His eyes photographed the curved walls, the passengers seated opposite, and the extreme side view of the strap-hangers and slouchers by the door. The brain automatically developed the pictures so meticulously captured by the eyes, and began to store them away in the dark recess which is the lumber room of memory. Then it grabbed one back and retained it for the soul's consideration. At first the soul did not want to know. It swiftly thrust the picture into the lumber room and slammed the door. The brain suggested a retake. The soul vetoed the idea. The brain, being the irritating, curiosity-ridden organ that it was, insisted. Percy, with great reluctance, lowered his newspaper and looked towards the door. There was no manner of doubt. Doris was hanging onto a strap and staring at him. Absolutely no shred of comforting, sanity-saving doubt. Blue hat, steel-rimmed glasses, wen, shabby grey coat, slightly wrinkled stockings and sensible shoes. nothing missing. She had that blank, long-suffering expression, which suggested that she was expecting him to do something, but knew very well that he wouldn't. Outside on the platform a voice commanded, "Mind the doors," and the doors obediently slid together. Then the train jerked into motion. But Percy continued to stare back at his late wife. This should have been an excellent opportunity for him to try out his theory and stand beside her, but he was too petrified to move, let alone talk. The train took its time in getting to Waterloo. Just as though wishing to prolong the agony, it stopped twice, and once, to Percy's great horror, the lights flickered as if considering the possibility of going out. It was then that Doris broke the spell. She jerked her head round and stared at an advertisement for Gordon's gin, and freedom of movement returned. Fear withdrew a little way, and Percy was able to clear his mind of panic debris. Suppose, just suppose, that someone with a warped, perverted sense of humour were playing a distasteful but, oh Lord, soul-saving practical joke. Suppose they had found Doris's double and lined her up in a replica of Doris's clothes. That would be a rational explanation, but it was not a very convincing one. Belatedly, he began to consider his original intention of getting up and speaking to her. But scarcely had he flexed his leg muscles that the train rushed into Waterloo Underground Station, and a crowd of passengers had risen from their seats. The doors sighed, then slid open, and Doris was swept out onto the platform, and Percy, a few yards behind, saw her blue hat bobbing up and down like a rogue boy in a rough sea. He kept her in sight when the crowd surged into a side passage and had forced his way within 3 bodies' distance when the queue formed for the lift. It was then that he noticed how still she was. There was not even the slightest suggestion of movement, no shifting of feet, no jerk of the head, no wriggling of shoulders, no, now he came to think of it, rise and fall that denotes breathing. One might suppose that here was an automaton, with its engine switched off. A roaring of displaced air announced the arrival of the lift. The door crashed open, and a ticket collector stood to one side with outstretched hand. He snatched at the tickets, with all of the enthusiasm of a fruit picker gathering strawberries, but when Doris passed him, he gave her a single glance, then instantly turned his attention to the next passenger. Percy was positive that he had seen her, but it was as though his brain had rejected her presence. It was this simple action that finally convinced Percy he was, in fact, following the ghost of his dead wife. The lift gave a great sigh and stopped. The crowd surged out, and Percy followed Doris, first up a short flight of steps, then up a slight incline and out into the main station. The blue hat bobbed its way towards platform 16, and again a ticket officer gave her one swift glance before scowling at a little man who had forgotten to show his season ticket. Doris walked slowly along the platform until she found a carriage with the door open. She climbed in and sank down into a corner seat and looked dejectedly out of the window. Percy, after a vain trying to curb the brain's damnable lust for knowledge, performed the most courageous act of his life. He bounded into the carriage and sat down beside her. He was ignored. The still figure was a study in non-movement. Percy's trembling hands opened a newspaper and spread it out before he dared look sideways. Again he had a close-up view of a scrawny neck with thin grey hair combed into an unbecoming bun, which in some small measure supported the blue hat. What would happen if he were to touch her? Nothing on earth could have made him experiment. But speech was a kind of abstract contact. If those waxen-looking ears still functioned, she might hear a whispered inquiry, always supposing that he could force his tongue to make one. 3 times his vocal cords contracted, 3 times his lips parted, and it was not until he had closed his eyes and taken a very deep breath that he was able to send out one whispered word. "Doris." At that moment the train jerked into violent movement, and the figure swayed, so that for an awful, heart-thumping eternity Percy thought it was going to fall back against him. Then the train assumed an even, clackety-clack speed, and the figure once again became a study in still life. Although Percy could not think this was a good simile, he gathered his courage and breath and expelled the latter in a whispered question. "Doris, is that you?" Then the head came slowly round, and the steel-rimmed spectacles gave him one expressionless stare. Then the bloodless lips parted, and an answering whisper said, "You're late." It was perhaps unfortunate that Percy had not noticed he had boarded the slow train, because even as he was digesting this piece of disturbing information, it slowed down and stopped at Vauxhall Station. When someone opened the door, Doris, without removing her expressionless stare from his face, climbed down onto the platform with a kind of crab-like movement. She remained stationary while a porter slammed the door, but as the train pulled away, Percy thought he detected a slight, irritated shaking of the head. As may be imagined, he was very unhappy and decided to seek expert advice. Madame Orloff, medium extraordinaire, messages from the Onde Speciality, no longer touted for business. Gone were the days when she handed out cards at railway stations and accosted perfect strangers. Now a discreet advertisement in The Apparition, Madame Orloff is prepared to consider a few recommended additions to her select clientele, was all that was needed to keep body and soul together in the manner to which she had grown accustomed. She was not, therefore, at all pleased when she answered an urgent ringing of her doorbell and discovered a distraught Percy on the front step. Neither was she prepared to be gracious. "Yes?" Percy made a motion which suggested he was wiping his feet prior to making an uninvited entry. "You are Madame Orloff, the medium?" "The famous medium, yes." Could I speak to you for a few minutes?" "About what?" Percy dry-washed his hands, looked from left to right, inspected his shoes, then rerouted his attention to Madame Orloff's full figure. "Well, it's my wife. She's been dead—" "Passed over," Madame corrected. Yes, passed over for 6 months, but I keep seeing her on the district train." "A distinct possibility. It makes a break for the poor dears, after a stint on the Circle line. So what?" "Well, I'd like to see you about it." Madame Orloff withdrew from her doorway with some reluctance. "Well, very well, but I can't give you long. I've got a possession coming in half an hour by appointment, and I usually have a little kip before I do any casting out." She led her unexpected and unrecommended client across the hall and ushered him into a room that was situated at the rear of the house. Here Percy was all but pushed into a chair. Then the medium seated herself behind an impressive desk. "Right, let's get down to it then. What sort of party was your wife? Strong-minded? Like to have things just so?" Percy nodded. You could say so. Mind you, she was quiet, didn't say much, but had a will of her own." Madame Orloff gave him a shrewd glance that took in his neat, well-brushed suit, polished shoes, and the way he clutched his hat in both hands. "And I expect you used to help her do a few jobs around the house. Bit of washing up, maybe?" Percy's eyes widened with astonishment, and his respect for Madame's exceptional psychic powers grew. "Yes, how did you know?" The medium shrugged. "There's not much hid from us that have the gift. Now, how many times have you seen your wife on the train?" Twice on the district and once on the underground. Madame Orloff shook her head angrily. That underground! If I had my way, I'd have it blown up. What with it being a cesspit for elementals, demons, poltergeists, and hobgoblins, to say nothing of the millions of misguided souls, like your passed over, it's a wonder to me anyone has the nerve to go down there. Talk about possession, what? The number of stories I could tell you of people who came up with something they didn't go down with. Any road, at least your missus has a bit of initiative. She changes over to the district now and again. Percy frowned. But what I can't understand is what she's doing on the trains. Madame Orloff smiled grimly. You may well ask. It's become a sort of habit with them. In my young days, I doubt you'd have come across a travelling haunter once in a blue moon. Now, stone the crows. British Railways and London Transport attracts them like flies through gum paper. I suppose it's because the earthbounds like to keep moving, and you've got to admit the trains do move sometimes. The rush hours are best, of course. They can get around without giving offence, if you get my meaning. Percy tried to absorb all this information, but one question still had to be answered satisfactorily. Doris used to go to chapel 3 times every Sunday, and I'm sure she never thought that trains, well, would be the, ultimate destination. Ah, she's waiting for her little hubby to come and give her a hand. Stands to reason. All of them are mostly waiting for someone. Have you ever spoken to her? Percy hesitated for a moment. Then he nodded. Yes, once. Madame Orloff beamed her approval. That's nice. People are sometimes backwards in coming forward when it comes to having a chat with the passed over. What did she say? She said I was late. Had he looked up at that moment, he might have detected a hint of embarrassment in Madame's rather protuberant eyes. She began to trace a pattern on the desk with a pudgy forefinger. I'm sure that was very nice, dear. Tell me, have you been rather poorly lately? Been off your food? Percy assumed the expression of a rabbit who is beginning to understand the purpose of a cooking pot. No, I feel fine, absolutely fine. Madame Orloff raised her thick eyebrows as though to denote surprise. Then she continued to trace an invisible pattern on the desktop. I'm pleased to hear that, dear, very pleased. But your dear passed over did say you were late, didn't she? Yes. Percy wriggled slightly in his chair. I've been trying to understand what she meant. Well, it doesn't take much gumption to work that out. I mean to say, you don't need a college education. She meant you were late, overdue, all behind, as the saying goes. Follow me, dear? You mean... Yes, I do. You should have been doing the old Circle line for some time. Had any near misses lately? You know, almost fell downstairs, or something of that nature. I did almost drown in the municipal swimming baths, but an attendant pulled me out just in time. He said I was lucky. He should have been off duty. Madame Orloff nodded her satisfaction. That would be it. You should have gone then. I expect your dear passed over was put out. Never mind. She'll try to put things right, so I wouldn't worry too much. You mean I'm going to have another accident? Oh, I'd say you can bet on it. Your good lady sounds like a very determined soul to me, and her patience must be wearing a bit thin. Well, it stands to reason. So you go home and leave it all to her. Is anything wrong? There was a good reason for her inquiry, for Percy was on his feet and making all haste towards the door. He was also shaking his head in frantic denial and trying to express his total disbelief by shouting, I don't believe you! Doris would never do this to me! Madame Orloff grinned as she heaved her considerable bulk from the chair. Don't kid yourself. She won't half give you chip when the time comes. No woman likes to be kept waiting. Percy was out of the room and running for the front door, and was in no condition to heed Madame's cry of rage. What about my fee? I don't do this for peanuts, you know. The Green Line bus service gained another regular passenger. Percy derived a rather grim kind of pleasure, imagining Doris looking for him vainly on either the 5:45 train or the Underground. It was rather like that time he had dodged chapel and gone to Sunday cinema instead. Then he shuddered as he remembered that Doris had been waiting for him in the foyer. She had an uncanny knack of knowing what he would do next, and there was no reason to suppose that a change of location would have dulled her perceptive powers. For 3 days and nights he imitated a man sitting on an unexploded bomb. Then on the 4th, a Thursday, which had never been his lucky day, the bus decided to terminate its journey at Hammersmith, and the driver looked round at his passengers with an expression of quiet triumph and ordered, "All change, so far as we go." Percy was faced with a problem. He could either wait for another bus, which would mean arriving at the office half an hour late, or take to the Underground. There was no reason to suppose that Doris was down there. On the other hand, there was no certainty that she was not. Good heavens, she might be waiting for him on the platform. It was while considering this mind-shattering prospect that Percy happened to look up and see his late wife watching him from the other side of the road. A stream of cars went by. They were closely followed by 2 lorries, 1 hearse, and a double-decker bus. Then Percy was able to derive the full benefit of Doris's expressionless stare. Suddenly, she raised her arm and beckoned. It was an imperious gesture, the kind of impatient, irritated wave that had on many occasions greeted him from the front gate whenever he arrived home late. He was used to it. It had become an essential part of married life and created a kind of built-in reflex, which meant Percy usually broke into a little trot. It did not fail now. Without further thought, he stepped into the road, became unaware of the sound of screeching brakes before a powerful hand pulled him back onto the pavement. Doris made a savage gesture of extreme annoyance before she walked quickly toward the Underground station. "Tired of life, I dare say," the burly constable remarked caustically. "No, oh dear no." "Suicide is not illegal," the constable went on, "but it's a bit rough on us blokes if we have to scrape you off the road. I'm so sorry, I wouldn't want to be any trouble." "Then use your bloody eyes." Percy eventually hired a taxi. Next morning, Doris was on the Green Line bus. Percy did not see her at first. In fact, it was not until they were passing Barnes Common that he spotted her reflection in the window. She was seated on the opposite side of the aisle, 2 rows back, and indulging in her usual practice of looking out of the window. Percy trembled and flirted with the idea of getting out at the next stop, only there did not seem to be much point. She would doubtlessly follow him, and the traffic was moving too fast for comfort. There comes a point when familiarity blunts the sharp edge of fear. It is then that the unusual assumes the appearance of the commonplace, and mental disturbance the aspect of a calm sea. Percy, without being aware of this fact, had been becoming gradually accustomed to seeing his late wife on public transport, and might have eventually accepted this state of affairs had he not been aware of her lamentable intentions. As it was, he found himself considering defensive measures, while not forgetting to keep a wary eye on Doris, who, he fancied, was watching his reflection in the window. The simple solution, if he were not to meet with the destined accident, was to be constantly alert, and to make absolutely certain there was always a safe distance between them. For an apparition, she looked remarkably solid, and might quite well be capable of meting out a good shove, should a suitable occasion arise. He must ignore all gestures that demanded haste, look both ways before he crossed the road, hang on to the black moving rail when he went down an escalator, and mind the step when he got out of a tube train. In fact, the list seemed endless, and his heart sank when he considered the task before him. But surely, if he lasted out long enough, she would give up. When the bus reached Hyde Park Corner, he made a dash for the door, then tore along the pavement, clutching his briefcase in one hand and his umbrella in the other. So far as he could see, Doris had not followed him. It was a small victory, but at least she must now realize that her intentions were not welcome. From then on, life was never dull. Percy found there was safety in speed, just so long as he looked where he was going. When he found Doris waiting at the bus stop, he ran for the railway station. The merest glimpse of her on the 5:45 sent him scurrying for the Underground. But of course all of this activity was very wearing. Percy lost so much weight, he wondered if there was any need to worry unduly about a fatal accident. People acquired the habit of giving him pitying looks, and even, on occasion, making unfortunate remarks. An ancient aunt, who he had not seen for some time, gave him one horrified look, and said, "A thin corpse makes hasty burying." And fear, which up to then had been content to walk in his footsteps, leapt upon his shoulders. But the body still did not want to die, so the brain was ordered to devise a plan that would keep death forever locked up in tomorrow. Such a burden had not been placed upon that idle, curiosity-ridden organ for many a year, but it did its poor best to explore every avenue of escape, and finally came up with a proposed solution that brought a glimmer of hope to the darkness of Percy's despair. Why not, instead of running, walk beside? In fact, better still, follow. Let the hauntee become the haunter. Give her a dose of her own medicine. Percy actually did a little dance of joy round the kitchen when the full beauty of the scheme became visible. He would beckon to her whenever she appeared on the other side of the road, creep up behind her and whisper, "You're bloody late," and wait for the reaction. Was it Wellington or Napoleon said, "Attack is the best means of defence"? Whoever said it, it was right. Percy sat down and ate a hearty breakfast for the first time in weeks. It was such a relief to know he was on the attack and not running any more. That morning he caught the 8:30 to Waterloo, and had the satisfaction of spotting his quarry the moment he entered the compartment. Doris was sitting in her usual place by the window. Percy smiled and felt very confident. He raised his hat and said, "Morning, Doris. Sorry if I've kept you waiting." It was not, perhaps, the happiest of remarks, because he was keeping her waiting, and she stressed her disapproval by turning her head and staring out of the window. Percy did not allow this action to deter him. He felt like a boy who had just left school and can now cheek the master. "You'll never guess what I did last night. Spilt tea all over your best tablecloth, you know, the one that your mother gave us." Her face betrayed no sign that she had heard him, but he saw one hand tighten up into a fist. His imagination took flight, and he leapt from one outrageous lie to another. "Do you remember how you used to nag me whenever I cracked a plate? Well, there's not much left of the willow-pattern dinner service. 2 vegetable dishes and a meat dish, as a matter of fact, and 1 lid among the lot." Her head quivered, a clenched fist moved, but that was all. He went one earth-shaking step farther. "The cat hasn't half made a mess of the Indian bedspread." The head jerked around, and never would he have thought it possible that a face which was so dead, so white and devoid of emotion, could portray such a picture of blazing, impotent rage. He felt like a man who had been tormenting a caged lion, only some invisible bars kept her at bay. But instead of fear, He experienced a surge of triumphant joy. She was dead, he was alive, and intended to remain so, and he could say anything he damn well liked. He stared straight at her and poked out his tongue. Doris unclenched her fists once again and turned her face to the window. Percy would have liked to have continued his lion-baiting, but it was then he became aware that several people were looking at him in the oddest way. So he unfolded his newspaper and contented himself by watching Doris over it, just in case she tried to do something tricky. When the train rattled into Waterloo, he opened the carriage door, and after making a little ironic bow, said softly, "After you." She climbed down onto the platform, with head held high, shoulders stiffly erect, and began to walk swiftly toward the ticket barrier, with Percy close behind. He enlivened their progress by such remarks as, "Get up, there's going to be a flood. Watch it, you've got 2 left feet." And when she quickened her pace, "Hold it, you've forgotten your saddle." Once past the ticket barrier, she broke into a run, and Percy, after emitting a little cry of joy, galloped after her. They both made the lift just before the doors closed, but unfortunately a fat man squeezed between them, so that Percy was unable to continue his exorcising treatment. When the crowd swept out into the lower regions, where passage meets passage in the midst of a mind-numbing labyrinth, Percy found he had lost his prey. She had vanished. The heat had become too hot in the kitchen, and Doris had got out. Percy, to the profound enjoyment of all those in his immediate vicinity, laughed, danced, swore, and finally cried. It was reasonable to suppose that the attack procedure was an unqualified success. Now he would be extremely disappointed if she were not on the homeward-bound train. He devised new insults, invented little acts of ridicule that must surely rouse her to a state of impotent rage. But of course he must never lower his guard, always make certain she was in front and he was in the rear. When the first shadows of night fell across the city, Percy Fortescue put on his coat and hat, gathered up his briefcase and umbrella, then set forth to renew the hunt. Doris was not on the Piccadilly line, and he experienced a twinge of disappointment. Neither, so far as he could see, was she on the Bakerloo train, but the crowd was so dense that an entire army of ghosts could be flattened between strap-hanging bodies or whimpering against doors. With many a look to the rear, Percy hastened on to the lift and gave a little squeal of alarm when a woman in a blue hat pressed her handbag into his back. But it was not Doris, and he came up into the main station without so much of a glimpse of his quarry. The 5:45 was still only half filled, so Percy was able to examine each compartment without difficulty. He found her at the far end of the train, huddled against the off-side window, head averted, shoulders hunched, looking like a badly wrapped parcel that someone had forgotten. He climbed in, put his umbrella and briefcase up on the luggage rack, then sat down beside her. "Evening?" He kept his voice low. "Thought I'd missed you." There was no response, but he did not expect one. "Why did you run away this morning? It wasn't a nice thing to do. I've so much to say, and you never gave me much opportunity to talk when you were alive. For example, I never did mention how much I hated you, although, to be fair, I did not realize it myself at the time. I only knew you were mean, small-minded, sanctimonious, petty, and an awful person to live with. Are you listening?" The back of her neck was more wax-like than ever, and he felt such a sudden surge of anger. She was treating him with contempt. His words, his feelings were not worthy of her attention. He raised his voice slightly. "Why did I marry you, eh? Didn't you ever ask yourself that question once in all those years? I'll tell you. I thought that anyone so unattractive, I could use the word ugly, would always be grateful. I overlooked the undeniable fact that women only look into rose-tinted mirrors. He drew a little nearer, and his voice turned into a harsh, vibrant whisper. "Get back to hell, you ugly old cow!" She still did not move, but her whisper thundered through the dark corridors of his mind. "My mother is only 2 carriages back." He became aware that the train had already begun its journey towards Richmond, and the living people, so far as he knew, had filled every seat and overflowed into the aisles, but he was now more alone than at any time during his life. He wondered what would be the reaction if he were to jump up and shout, "That thing in the corner, it's my dead wife!" Would they all gape at him? Or, and this was a chilling thought, just nod their heads and say, "Yes, we know"? If his mother-in-law, may she burn forever, was 2 carriages back, what proof had he that all of them were not dead as Christmas turkey? Hell below, all 14 stone of the old hag had been planted in Brockwood Cemetery 25 years ago. He shuddered and looked at his nearest neighbours with terrible suspicion. That fat man who was propped up against the far door looked unpleasantly waxy, and that long, lean woman with sticky-out teeth, she might as well have strayed from some far-off damp grave. Then bravado, the dire need to drive fear back behind the frontiers of sanity, made him turn to Doris again. "Let the old hag come. I'll settle her hash too. Dead or alive, it's all the same to me. Let 'em all come." Silence. Rigid immobility, fired by a childish and, by now, terror-tinted fear. Percy would have liked to have punched that motionless figure, but once when his knee touched hers, there was such a bone-chilling coldness. He slumped back against the same dour-faced woman from whom he had received warning frowns on earlier occasions. When the train arrived at Richmond, he edged his way from the compartment and did not wait to see if Doris's mother was on the lookout for him. That night he did not sleep much, but spent the small hours feeding his courage. He rehearsed all the cutting remarks he would make to Doris's mother should she put in an appearance next morning. Then he remembered the formidable bulk, the immense moon-like face, and hastily turned on the bedside lamp. "She won't scare me!" he shouted, and the cat, which had been sleeping on the foot of the bed, beat a hasty retreat. Doris was back in her customary position by the window, and Percy, true to his newly acquired determination, sat down beside her. He asked the all-important question, "All right, where is the old hag?" It is a pity he had not looked to the left and right when he entered the compartment, because Doris's mother was seated opposite. He said, "Oh, my God!" and stared at her with open mouth and bulging eyes. She really was most awful. A great, round face endowed with 3 chins, little eyes that glittered from behind horn-rimmed spectacles, shoulders that would not have disgraced a coal-heaver, a bosom that verged on the impossible, and legs like miniature tree trunks. She wore a black straw hat, a grey coat with moth-blitzed fur collar, and a pair of buttoned-up boots. To make matters worse, she did not look out of the window. The small, unblinking eyes, magnified by the spectacles, stared straight at Percy. The dead, white face wore an expression of frozen disapproval, and the overall impression was that of a corpse that had died while in a fit of excessive bad temper. Percy stared back until his self-control exploded into an eruption of terror-born rage. "Who do you think you're staring at?" What with one thing and another, Percy was becoming a source of entertainment for bored commuters. Newspapers rustled, heads were raised, dull eyes brightened, and there was a general air of lively excitement. But Percy's mother-in-law did not appear to be impressed. She remained a solid, motionless, larger-than-life wax doll, and her magnified stare never left Percy's face. He might have spoken again, had he not been forestalled by a sudden, low whisper. It came from Doris, who was still indulging her passion for looking out of train windows. "Daddy is in the guard's van." Percy sank back and closed his eyes. Despair came strolling down the avenues of time and took up residence in Percy's brain. It banished hope with a hollow laugh, slaughtered confidence with a tiny frown, and welcomed horror with a grisly smile. Percy knew he had lost. Doris allowed someone to open the door before slowly descending to the platform. There she stood waiting, and Percy, after a fearful glance at his mother-in-law, knew what was expected of him. Presently they were a compact family group, with wife in front, husband behind, mother-in-law to the left, and father-in-law moving in. Doris's father had been a very large man, and was in every way a worthy spouse for his formidable partner. 6'4" high by 3'6" wide, he had a face of granite and fists like bunches of iron grapes. He took up a position next to Percy. He took up a position to Percy's right, and the family group moved forward. Through the ticket barrier, across the station, down the steps and into the lift. Here Percy surrendered his season ticket. He would be travelling free from now on. On the Bakerloo platform they allowed one train to come and go, but looked grimly at Percy when the second announced its imminent arrival by a fast-growing roar. Percy trembled and closed his eyes, and from somewhere close behind came a nasty little tittering laugh. The roar exploded into a shriek of triumph as the train was vomited out of the tunnel mouth, and father-in-law's voice rumbled as he spoke the fatal words, "Over you go, and happy landing." They all shoved together. Percy found himself in a corner seat, and he was looking miserably out of the window. The train was just drawing into Charing Cross Station. It was then that he turned his head and took an interest in his surroundings. Mother-in-law and father-in-law were seated opposite. Doris was on his left. They were all smirking and resembled 3 cats preparing to share one mouse. Percy ventured to ask a question. "Where are we going?" "To Leicester Square," said Doris. "Then change for King's Cross," added father-in-law. "For a nice trip to Walthamstow Central," mother-in-law stated. "And back to Finsbury Park," said Doris. "Then up to Cockfosters, back to Hyde Park Corner. We'll spend the night in Victoria Station, first-class waiting room," promised father-in-law. People poured in from the platform. Seats were crowded, overhead straps sagged under the weight of hangers-on, aisles were packed solid with homeward-bound, work-bound, commuters, and demons, disguised as porters, glared in through the grime-fogged windows. "It's always the rush hour," said Doris. "Eternally," added father-in-law. Mother-in-law had the last word. She always had. "Forever and ever."